I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was there. Not for all of it, nobody was there for all of it. That's kind of the point. But I was there for enough. I was there the morning she came down from that mountain with mud on her boots and something strange in her eyes. I was there when she found the first thing. And I was there, barely, holding myself together, the night the whole truth finally came out. And I'm telling you right now, nothing could have prepared any of us for what Mara Calloway's life actually was. Not her mother, not the people in town who whispered about her choices, not even me, and I've known Mara since we were 7 years old, sharing a lunch table in a school that smelled like chalk dust and cafeteria pizza. Nobody knew. Because the man she married, the man they all called poor Eli Voss from up the mountain, had been carrying a secret so enormous, so carefully constructed, so deliberately hidden, that it had changed the course of 3 generations of lives before Mara even walked into his. And the reason he hid it. That's the part that'll stay with you. Set up. Let me take you back. The year was 2031. Now, you need to understand what 2031 felt like if you lived in a place like Creston Valley. You need to understand what it was like to be in a small mountain town, maybe 400 people, a single grocery store, 2 churches, and a diner that somehow still served coffee in mugs with chip marks on the rims, while the rest of the world was doing things that felt like science fiction. Because in 2031, that's exactly what the rest of the world was doing. The Meridian Accord had been signed 2 years earlier. That was the agreement, the first real, legally binding agreement, between Earth's coalition government and the Velthari Collective. 7 alien species, organized under one diplomatic umbrella, agreeing to formal trade relations with humanity. Most people couldn't even say Velthari right when the news first broke. My uncle kept calling them the Vlarth. My grandmother refused to believe it was real until a Velthari shuttle landed on the roof of the UN building in Geneva, and the video went globally viral in about 11 seconds. The world changed fast. Within 18 months, coalition trade posts had been established in 47 cities. Technology exchanges were happening. Xenobotanical compounds were being licensed to pharmaceutical companies. Velthari mineral mapping drones had already tripled the known deposits of rare earth elements across South America and Central Asia. And the Galactic Corridor Project, the thing that would eventually tear Mara's life open and put it back together in a completely different shape, had just broken ground. The corridor was a transit infrastructure network. Think of it like a highway system, but the highway connected ground-level Earth facilities to orbital relay stations maintained by the Velthari and 2 other coalition species, the Dorak and the Ushan. It was supposed to revolutionize cargo movement, eventually passenger movement. Eventually, if the optimists were right, interstellar access for qualified human personnel. The corridor needed land. Massive stretches of it, not just urban corridors. Mountain terrain, specifically. Because the relay anchor points needed elevation, needed rock foundation deep enough to absorb the energy outputs of transit conduits, needed distances from population centers that could absorb the electromagnetic field signatures that the early generation conduit tech still threw off. And the coalition had sent survey teams. Quiet ones at first. Most people in Creston Valley knew the survey teams had come through. Black vehicles, scanning equipment, a few people in unmarked jackets who didn't stop to talk. They came, they measured, they left. The town talked about it for a week and then moved on. What nobody knew, what nobody in town knew, was that the survey teams had found something. Not just something. Something enormous. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I do that. Mara always told me I do that. She'd say, "Nadia, you're already at the ending before you've even told me who was there." So let me go back. Let me start where Mara's story actually starts. Let me start with the mountain. Creston Valley sits in a fold of the Cascade Range, not the famous part, not the part with the ski resorts and the tourists and the Instagram landscapes, the unfamous part. The part where the roads aren't quite wide enough for two trucks to pass comfortably, and the winters come early and stay long, and people grow up knowing the names of ridgelines the way city kids know the names of streets. Eli Voss had lived on the eastern slope of Heron's Ridge his entire life. His father had lived there. His grandfather had built the original cabin there, a low, dark-timbered structure with thick walls and a root cellar that went back 12 feet into the hillside. 3 generations of Voss men, same mountain, same 40-acre parcel, same reputation in town. The Vosses keep to themselves. That's what people said. Not unkindly exactly, more like a fact. Like saying the Heron Creek runs cold even in July or the road past the mill floods every spring. Just a thing that was true and had always been true and wasn't particularly worth questioning. Eli came down to town maybe twice a month. He'd buy supplies from the Granger's store, the kind of supplies that told you he was living simply up there. Rice, dried beans, oats, canned tomatoes, the occasional sack of flour. He kept a kitchen garden in the summer and a wood stockpile that people in town sometimes mentioned because it was always enormous. Like, unsettlingly large. More wood than one person could burn in 2 winters. He did occasional work for people. Fixed engines. Repaired fencing. Had a talent for old machinery that the agricultural supply co-op in the next town over sometimes called him in for. He was paid, and he seemed to live on the payment, and nobody thought much about it. He was 31 when Mara met him. She was 28. And I want to be honest with you about something. Mara was not in a fairy tale when she walked into Eli Voss's life. She was not a princess looking for adventure. She was a woman who had just come through a genuinely hard 2 years. She'd left a job she'd loved, teaching 4th grade at the elementary school in Portland, after a relationship ended in a way that was ugly and public, and left her feeling hollowed out in a way that I, as her best friend, watched happen and couldn't fully help with. She came home to Creston Valley to breathe. That's all she said when she called me. I just need to breathe for a while, Nadia. I need somewhere that doesn't feel like the city. She moved back into her mother's house on Talcott Street. She started working part-time at the Granger's store, the same store Eli came into twice a month for his rice and his beans and his enormous quantities of canned tomatoes. That's how it started. She told me about it a week after their first real conversation. We were on the phone, and I could hear something in her voice, not excitement exactly, more like interest. The way your voice gets when something has genuinely caught your attention and you're not sure yet what to do about it. There's this man who comes in, she said. Okay, I said. He's quiet, like really quiet, but not rude quiet, more like, she paused. More like a person who just doesn't feel the need to perform being normal, you know. I said I thought I knew. He fixed the scanner at the checkout because it was making that grinding noise, and Maria was just accepting the grinding noise as a permanent feature of existence. And he just walked in one day, looked at it, asked Maria if she wanted him to take a look, and fixed it in about 8 minutes with a pocket knife and a small wrench he had on his belt. That's practical, I said. That's what I said to him, Mara told me. I said, that's really practical. And he looked at me. He has these very dark eyes, Nadia, kind of unusual, and he said, most things just need someone to pay attention to them. I was quiet for a second. Mara, I said. I know, she said. That's a line. I know, she said again. But he didn't say it like a line. He said it like he actually meant it, like he was talking about the scanner. And that distinction right there is what you need to understand about Eli Voss. He didn't say things to impress people. He said things because they were true. And the things he said that were true also happened to be, sometimes, quietly devastating in how much they revealed about the way he looked at the world. Mara was a woman who'd spent 2 years with someone who said beautiful things that weren't true. She had an antenna for authenticity by then, a very finely tuned one. She started looking forward to Tuesdays and Fridays. Those were his days. They talked more slowly. The way two people talk when neither of them wants to rush something and both of them have been burned before. He told her about the mountain, about Heron's Ridge and the cabin and the kitchen garden. He didn't make it sound romantic. He made it sound like what it was, a life that required a lot of work, that offered a lot of quiet, and that suited him. She told him about Portland, about the teaching. He asked careful questions about what it was like to work with children that age, not the fluffy questions, not "oh, it must be so rewarding," but actual questions. What's the hardest thing to teach them? What do they understand that adults don't? She told me that second question nearly undid her. What do they understand that adults don't? She thought about it seriously and told him, time. They understand that an afternoon can be infinite, that an hour can contain a whole world. We forget that. He'd looked at her for a long moment. I know someone who needs to hear that, he said. She waited for him to say who. He didn't. He picked up his bags and said goodbye and walked out. She thought about it for 3 days. He asked her, eventually, if she wanted to see the mountain. Not a date. He didn't call it a date. He said, I'm going up Saturday morning to check on the east fence line. It's a good walk if you don't mind early starts. Nice views from the ridge if the weather holds. She said yes. It was early October. The aspens on the lower slope were going gold, and there was a sharp edge to the morning air that made everything feel cleaner. She drove her mother's old truck up to where the road ended, really ended, became just a track in the grass, and he was already there, waiting, with 2 thermoses of coffee. He gave her one without asking if she wanted it. She told me later that that was the moment she thought, this person pays attention. They walked 4 hours up and around the eastern face of Heron's Ridge. He knew every inch of it. He could name the trees, not just the species, but individual trees, the way you name people. That Douglas fir came down in the ice storm of 2019. I cut most of it for firewood but left the root ball because the woodpeckers use it. He knew where the deer bedded in November. He knew which rocky outcroppings held heat longest into the evening. He knew the mountain the way very few people know anything anymore, with patience, with history, with a deep, quiet attention. And then they came over the East Ridge, and Mara stopped walking. Because spread out below them was Heron's Valley, a private valley, hidden behind the ridge, not visible from any road or trail on the map. Just a bowl of land, maybe 30 acres, with a cold creek running through the center of it, and grass that in October had gone to rust and amber, and a silence so complete that Mara said she could hear her own heartbeat. Nobody knows about this, she asked. My family's known for about 80 years, he said. We don't advertise. She looked at him, why not? He looked at the valley for a long moment. Some things, he said, are worth more when they're protected. They were engaged by the following spring. I'll skip over the middle part, not because it isn't important, but because some things between 2 people are genuinely private and I only know what Mara chose to share with me. But I can tell you the shape of it. It was slow, it was careful, it was real in a way that made me slightly jealous even though I was happy for her. They spent weekends on the mountain. She learned to identify the deer tracks. He started reading again, books she suggested, and would text her his thoughts in complete sentences at odd hours of the night. She helped him refinish the floors of the old cabin. Her mother disapproved, gently but consistently. Eli Voss is a good man, her mother said to me once when Mara wasn't in the room. I've never heard a bad word about him, but Mara is. She stopped, started again. She has a master's degree. She's going to end up on that mountain with no income and no career, and in 10 years she's happy, I said. Her mother looked at me. She was happy in Portland too at first. I didn't have a good answer for that. The wedding was small, 20 people in the Talcott Street backyard in June. Mara wore a dress she'd found at an estate sale and altered herself ivory, with small buttons down the back. Eli wore a dark jacket that fit him well and a look on his face that I'd never seen on anyone's face at a wedding before. Not joy exactly, not relief, but something that looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been walking toward for a very long time. She moved up the mountain in July. The cabin was 3 rooms, a main room with a wood stove and a long table and bookshelves that covered every wall, a bedroom with a south-facing window that got the morning light, a back room that Eli used for tools and storage, and that had a locked interior door that he explained led to the root cellar. "It's just storage down there," he said. "Old stuff from my grandfather's time, not interesting." She accepted that, why wouldn't she? She was 30 years old and she was in love with a man who had shown her a secret valley, and who texted her his thoughts on books at midnight, and who had never, in the entire time she'd known him, said a single thing he didn't mean. She wasn't looking for secrets. Build tension. Her first winter on the mountain was hard. I want to be honest about that. Not because Eli was difficult, he wasn't. He was patient and steady, and he had spent his whole life on that mountain, and he knew every contingency, had a system for everything, never panicked. But Mara had been a city person for 8 years. The isolation was different when you were living it rather than visiting it. The dark came early. The silence at night was total in a way that sounds peaceful until you're inside it for the 3rd week in a row, and the road has been iced out for 5 days, and the satellite internet is running slow, and you feel, genuinely feel, like the rest of the world has forgotten this mountain exists. She called me sometimes, late at night when Eli was asleep, just to hear my voice. "Tell me something from out there," she'd say. And I'd tell her things, small things. The coffee place near my apartment had put up new art. My neighbor's cat had escaped and been found 3 blocks away. The world was doing its usual enormous complicated things. The Corridor Project was in the news constantly by then. Coalition survey teams expanding across the western mountain ranges, protests in some places about land acquisition, celebration in others about the jobs it was bringing. Normal 2031 chaos. She'd listen and say, "God, that sounds exhausting." And then she'd say, "But it's good here, I'm good. I just needed to hear a voice." In February, though, something started to shift. Not between her and Eli. They were fine, more than fine. But Mara is observant. It's what made her good at teaching, this ability to notice small things, and she started noticing small things. The first thing she noticed was the locked door. Not that she was suspicious of it. He'd told her it was the root cellar, old storage, not interesting. She believed him. But one evening in February, when Eli had gone down to town for supplies and she was alone in the cabin, she heard something from behind that door. Not a voice, not anything human. A hum. Low, very low, almost below the threshold of hearing. More of a vibration in the air than an actual sound. Like standing near a transformer box. Like the feeling you get in your chest when music is played at high volume in a neighboring room. She stood in the back room for a long time, listening to it. Then Eli came home and she heard the truck on the track, and she walked back to the main room, and she didn't mention it. She told me later, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. The second thing she noticed was the visitors. March, mud season. The track up the mountain was barely passable, and they'd agreed she would stay up top for a stretch while Eli made the supply runs, because the truck was unreliable in mud and 2 people made the logistics harder. She was in the kitchen garden area, turning the soil, when she heard a vehicle she didn't recognize. Not Eli's truck, different sound, higher-pitched engine. She went around the front of the cabin and saw it. A matte gray transport, large with no visible branding. The kind of vehicle that in 2031 had a specific association in everyone's mind: coalition infrastructure. The coalition fleet had a very particular aesthetic: geometric, minimal, with sensor arrays along the roofline that you could identify once you knew what to look for. Two people got out, a woman and a man, both in dark clothing, both carrying scanning equipment of some kind. They stopped when they saw Mara. There was a pause. The woman smiled, professional, practiced. "Good afternoon. We're with the Corridor Survey Team, pre-authorization pass 3. Is the property owner available?" "My husband is in town," Mara said carefully. "Can I help you?" Another pause. The man with the equipment glanced at the woman. "We have a standing survey access arrangement," the woman said, "established prior to the current property arrangement. We'll come back when Mr. Voss is available." They got back in the vehicle and left. Mara stood in the mud and watched the vehicle go down the track. Then she took out her phone and called Eli. "There were coalition survey people here," she said when he picked up. A beat of silence. Then, "I'll be home in 2 hours." "Eli." "2 hours, Mara, I'll explain." He did come home in 2 hours, but his explanation, when it came, was not an explanation. It was a careful, deliberate not explanation, the kind that tells you everything about what's being held back by the precision with which it's delivered. "The survey teams have a standing access arrangement because this ridge has certain geological features they need to monitor," he said. "It's been in place since before I owned the property. They check sensors a few times a year. It's routine." "What sensors?" she asked. "Monitoring equipment for the corridor assessment." "In the root cellar?" A very short pause. "Some of it, yes." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her. His face was, and this is what she said to me later with a kind of quiet despair that I could hear through the phone, his face was the same as always. Steady. Open, or what felt like open. No fear, no guilt, no visible wall. Just Eli, looking at her with those dark eyes that had always seemed to see exactly what she needed. "Eli," she said, "is there something you need to tell me?" Another pause, longer this time. "Not yet," he said. Not there's nothing." "Not yet." She told me later that those 2 words sat in her chest like a stone for the rest of the winter. April came. The snow on the upper ridge started pulling back. The aspen buds came in silver green, and the creek in Heron's Valley ran high with snowmelt. Mara had found a rhythm to mountain life by then: the early mornings, the physical work, the particular quality of silence that she'd gradually learned to hear not as absence but as presence. She was teaching herself to make bread. She was writing, not formally, just notes, observations, the kind of writing you do when the world has slowed down enough for you to notice things. She was almost at peace with the not yet. Almost. Then the letter came. Eli went down to the post office box. They had a box in town, no delivery this far up, and came back with the usual stack of things and one envelope that was different. Coalition government seal on the outside, the specific blue and silver of the Meridian Administrative Authority. Mara saw it in his hand when he came through the door. She watched his face as he looked at it. She saw something move through his expression, not fear, not exactly, but something that looked like a door closing very quietly inside him. "What is that?" she asked. "Business," he said. "Eli." He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. "I'll take care of it." He went into the back room. She heard the lock on the root cellar door, the door that led to the storage space that wasn't interesting. He was down there for 40 minutes. When he came back up, he was quiet for the rest of the evening. She didn't push. She made dinner and they ate and talked about small things: the garden, the creek level, a fox she'd seen near the woodshed, and she could feel the enormous unspoken thing sitting between them at the table like a third person who hadn't been introduced. That night when he was asleep, she lay in the dark and listened. The hum was there again, steady, low. Coming from below. She found the first thing on a Wednesday in May. Eli had gone out early to check the east fence line, the same walk they'd taken the first time, that October morning with the gold aspens and the thermos of coffee. He was usually gone 3 to 4 hours for that check. Mara had no plan. Let me be clear about that. She wasn't conducting an investigation. She wasn't working through a strategy. She was a woman who had heard a hum from a locked door for 3 months and had been told not yet by the man she loved, and had been patient in a way that had started to feel less like trust and more like fear. She tried the root cellar door. It was unlocked. She thought about that later, whether it was an accident, whether he'd forgotten to lock it, whether on some level he'd left it unlocked deliberately. She never got a clear answer, but it was unlocked and she was human and she opened it. The stairs went down about 12 feet, which was what you'd expect from a root cellar. The walls were the original stone of the hillside, cool and slightly damp. There was a single overhead light, an older fixture, and she found the switch on the wall and turned it on. And then she stood at the bottom of the stairs and understood that she was not in a root cellar. She was in a room. A large one, larger than any root cellar she'd ever imagined. The original cellar had clearly been expanded significantly at some point. The walls to the east and south were new. She could see the different quality of the stonework, more precise, more recent. The room was maybe 40 feet long and perhaps 20 wide, and it was. She didn't have words for it at first. She told me later she stood there for a full minute just trying to understand what she was seeing. Equipment, but not like any equipment she recognized. Panels along the east wall covered in interfaces that weren't keyboards and weren't touchscreens and weren't anything she could name, surfaces that seemed to respond to proximity, that had a faint inner luminescence, that were organized in a logic she couldn't follow, but that was clearly a logic, clearly intentional. Along the south wall, a series of cylindrical structures, floor to ceiling, each one maybe 3 feet in diameter, with a deep blue light at their cores that pulsed very slowly, like breathing. A low table in the center of the room covered in physical documents, actual paper, handwritten notes in Eli's handwriting, printed pages that were a mix of English and script she didn't recognize. And in the corner, a communication unit that looked like it had been assembled from parts of at least 3 different technological generations, with an active display showing what appeared to be a 3-dimensional map. She walked to the map first. It took her a moment to orient it. Then she recognized the shape of Heron's Ridge, the shape of the valley below, and radiating out from a central point, a point that corresponded, she realized, exactly to where she was standing right now, a network of lines that spread across the entire region. Not roads, not coalition infrastructure she recognized. Something else. Something that connected this mountain to 6 other points across a 500-mile radius. She stood there for a long time. Then she heard Eli's truck on the track. She turned off the light. She went back up the stairs. She closed the door behind her and walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink with her hands under cold water and waited for her breathing to slow down. He came through the door and she was making tea and she said, "How's the fence?" And he said, "East section needs a post," and that was the conversation. She didn't say anything about the room. But she called me that night, and her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. "Nadia," she said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to just listen until I'm done." I said okay. She told me about the room. I listened. The whole time she was talking I was trying to figure out what the right response was, whether to panic, whether to be reassuring, whether to tell her to get off that mountain right now. She got to the end and there was silence on the line. "Mara," I finally said. "I know. That's coalition technology. Some of that sounds like that communication array you described. That sounds like Velthari relay tech. There have been articles about what it looks like. I've seen pictures. That's not human-built equipment. I know, she said. Your husband has Velthari relay equipment in a hidden room under his mountain cabin. Yes. And he hasn't explained it. He said not yet. I thought for a moment. Okay, I said. So he's either some kind of coalition asset, and this is classified infrastructure, or he's something I don't have a word for yet, I said. She was quiet. Then, he's not dangerous. I know you're going to ask that. I've been on this mountain with him for almost a year. He's not dangerous. Whatever this is, he's not dangerous. You sound very certain. I am very certain, she said, and something in her voice told me she wasn't doing the thing where you convince yourself because you're afraid to face the alternative. She was just certain. The way you're certain of specific, concrete things. The way you're certain the stove is hot because you've touched it. Then you need to talk to him, I said. I know, she said. Tonight. A pause. Not tonight, she said. Climax. She waited a week. I don't know if she was gathering herself or gathering information, or just living with the knowledge long enough to figure out what shape the conversation needed to take. Probably all three. Mara has never been impulsive. It's something I admire and occasionally find maddening about her. She went back to the room once more while Eli was out. She spent more time with the documents on the central table. His handwriting was everywhere, calculations, notes, what looked like correspondence in English and one other script that she now recognized as Velthari, and she couldn't understand most of it, but she understood enough. She understood the dates. The earliest documents on the table were dated 2019. Eli had been 20 years old in 2019. 2 years before the first formal contact protocols. 4 years before the Meridian Accord. Back when alien intelligence was still officially a theoretical question, and the word Velthari hadn't been coined yet because nobody on Earth knew they existed. She stood there with a handwritten page from 2019 in her hand. Careful, precise handwriting. The same handwriting she recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen table. And something shifted in her understanding of everything. He hadn't gotten caught up in something. He'd been part of it from the beginning. She asked him on a Thursday evening. They'd had dinner, she'd made soup. The good one with the dried mushrooms, and the fire was going and the night outside was clear, the kind of clear you only get on a mountain at elevation, where the stars are not points of light but presences, massive and close and overwhelming if you let yourself really look at them. She said, Eli, I went into the root cellar. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. When? He asked. 3 weeks ago, and once more after that. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. And the thing that happened on his face in that moment, she described it to me carefully, and I've thought about it many times since. It was not fear, not anger, not the guilt of a man who's been caught. It was something that looked almost like relief. Like a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has been given permission, finally, to exhale. Okay, he said. Just that, okay. Okay, she said. Eli, there's a room under our house with Velthari relay equipment in it. I need you to talk to me. He was quiet for another moment. Then he got up and added wood to the fire and came back and sat down, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that she'd loved from the beginning, and he said, My grandfather made contact in 1987. She stared at him. His name was Aldous Voss. He was 63 years old. He had been on this mountain his whole life. He was, you know how I know things about machinery, how I can just see how things work. He was like that, but more. He built things, invented things. Nothing that got patented because he didn't want the attention, but extraordinary things. Things decades ahead of what anyone else was doing. He stopped, looked at the fire. The Velthari had been doing passive survey passes over Earth for almost 40 years by then, looking for specific things, Looking for, they have a word for it that translates roughly as reception-capable individuals, people with a particular way of thinking, a particular kind of precision combined with a particular kind of openness. It's rare. They'd found a few over the decades, made careful contact, tested communication. The earliest human Velthari contact wasn't governments, wasn't institutions. It was individuals, quiet ones, people they assessed carefully and approached. Mara was very still. My grandfather was one of those people, Eli said. He was contacted through a series of what appeared to be equipment malfunctions, things designed to catch his attention and see how he responded. He responded by solving them, by correctly deducing that they were signals, by constructing on his own with no guidance a basic response apparatus. Eli almost smiled. They weren't expecting that. That part wasn't in their protocol. 1987, Mara said. That's Eli, that's 50 years before the Accord. Yes. They were here 50 years before we knew about them. They were here much longer than that, he said quietly. They just weren't making contact much longer than that. Earth was, they described it the way a marine biologist might describe a reef, worth observing, worth protecting, worth approaching very carefully because the ecosystem is fragile and you can destroy what you're trying to understand. She was quiet, processing. My grandfather maintained the relationship for 11 years, Eli said. Until he died in 1998, he documented everything. Every communication, every exchange, every piece of technology they provided or helped him develop. He hid all of it down there, in the cellar that he expanded, the room you found. He wasn't hiding it because it was wrong. He was hiding it because they asked him to, because the right time hadn't come. Because they were, the Velthari are extremely patient, Mara. They think in timelines that make governments look impulsive. And your father? My father knew. He took over the relationship. He was in contact with them from 1998 until, a pause, until 2019, when he died. Mara counted, you were 20. I was 20, and I was the third generation, and by then the timeline was beginning to move. The formal contact protocols were already being developed on the Velthari side. The Accord was coming, they knew it was coming, had been setting conditions for it for years, and my family's role was changing. We'd been keepers, custodians of the relationship, of the technology, of the documentation. And now, she asked. He looked at her steadily. Now it was time for the transfer. She sat with that. The equipment in the room, she said, the relay array. It's a primary anchor point for the corridor transit network, he said. This ridge, the geological formation, the specific depth and composition of the rock, the position relative to the other nodes, it's been identified as a critical installation point. The coalition survey teams know. The coalition administrative authority knows. That letter that came in March was about the formal property arrangement, the compensation agreement. And there it was, the word she hadn't been expecting. Compensation. Eli, she said very carefully, what does the compensation agreement say? He looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he got up and went into the back room and came back with a folder, the kind of physical document folder that felt almost quaint in 2031, and he set it on the table between them and opened it. She read. She read it twice. The number on the page, the compensation figure for the installation, rights to the primary corridor anchor point on Heron's Ridge, plus the historical consultation fee for the three-generation Voss family relationship with the Velthari collective as documented by the Meridian Administrative Authority, was not a number that belonged in her life. It was not a number she had ever, in 30 years of being alive, expected to be in a document with her name on it. It was, in fact, a number that would have seemed fictional to her 2 hours ago. She set the document down. She looked at Eli. And here's what she said. This is the part she told me, and she was careful about the exact words because She'd been turning them over in her mind for weeks by the time she told me. You could have told me this before I married you. He didn't flinch. Yes. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the thing that I have thought about ever since she told me. Because I needed to know, he said, that you were here for me, not for this, not for what this turned into. I needed 1 year, just 1 year, of knowing that someone was on this mountain because they wanted to be, not because of what's under it. She stared at him. My grandfather never told my grandmother, he said. She found out 5 years after he died, from a coalition authority they didn't know they could contact. She was furious. I understood her being furious. But she also told my father later that the years before she knew were, she said they were the truest years. The ones where she just loved Aldous, not what he was part of, just him. Myra was quiet. I wanted that, he said. I wanted us to have that. I was going to tell you. I had a timeline. I was going to tell you at the 1-year mark this summer before the compensation agreement became active. He looked at her steadily. You found it early. I should have locked the door. Why didn't you? She asked. A long silence. I don't know, he said. Maybe I was ready. The fight that followed was real. I want to include that because the story is not clean. Mara was not some saint who heard this and smiled and said, "Oh, darling, I understand." She was furious. She told him, at increasing volume, to his credit he didn't flinch, that there was a difference between wanting to be loved for yourself and withholding the fundamental facts of someone's life from them. That she had made decisions about her career, about her financial contributions to their household, about her sense of her own worth and purpose, based on an understanding of their situation that was a fiction. That she had worried quietly for months about money, about whether they were okay, about whether she should try to find remote teaching work, and that whole time. He let her finish. He didn't defend himself through it. He sat and took it with the same steadiness he took everything, and when she was done he said, "You're right about all of that." "Don't be reasonable right now," she said, which was such a Mara thing to say that it almost made her cry. "I need you to be wrong about something." "I'm wrong," he said. "I made a decision that should have been yours to make too. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was protecting us. I was wrong." The fire had burned lower. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "Anything else I don't know?" He thought for a moment. "The valley," he said. "Heron's Valley, the hidden one. The Velthari designated it a protected ecological and atmospheric site about 12 years ago. Nothing can be built in it, nothing can be altered. There's a word in their language that means approximately a place of particular resonance. A place where conditions align in a way that is rare enough to be valuable and must be preserved." She stared at him. "They have a name for it in their records," he said. "The translation is approximate, but it means something like the valley that hums when the light is right." She was quiet for a very long time. "The hum I heard," she said, "from the cellar is that. The relay array transmits on a frequency that resonates with certain geological formations," he said. "The valley amplifies it naturally. My grandfather noticed it first in the 1990s. The Velthari said it was one of the conditions that made this site unique." Mara looked at him. "I heard the valley," she said. "Through the door. I heard it the whole winter." "Yes," he said. "And you were never going to tell me what it was." "I was going to tell you everything," he said. "This summer I had a whole," he stopped. "I had notes about how I was going to explain it." She almost laughed, almost. "Of course you had notes," she said. "Resolution." She didn't leave. I know some people reading this will expect that she did, or think she should have, or find the decision to stay somehow smaller than the decision to go. I'll tell you what she told me. Leaving would have been about the secret, she said. And the secret was obviously significant, obviously wrong of him to keep. But the man who kept it, the reasons he kept it, that was still Eli. That was still the person who named the trees and fixed the scanner and asked me what children understand that adults don't. She paused. I didn't fall in love with someone who had no complexity. I fell in love with someone who had more complexity than I knew. Those are different things. What she asked for, what she required, was full disclosure. Everything from the beginning. He gave it to her. It took 3 nights of conversation, going through the documented history in the root cellar that was not a root cellar, the communications and the technological exchanges, and the precise nature of the agreement that the Voss family had maintained across 3 generations. She read Aldous Voss's journals from the 1980s and 90s, careful, methodical records of a man who had been confronted with the most extraordinary thing in human history and had responded by taking meticulous notes. She read her father-in-law's communications, which were more emotional, more complex, marked by a loneliness she recognized, the loneliness of someone who is carrying something they cannot share. And she read Eli's own records, from 2019 onward. The 20-year-old who had inherited this responsibility without asking for it, who had maintained it with the same quiet precision his grandfather had shown, who had. And this was the part that got her, she told me, that genuinely undid her, who had written, in his own records, among the technical and administrative material, a note to himself that he had apparently added periodically over the years. The condition of all of this is that it means something human at the center. My grandfather understood that. The technology, the relationship, the extraordinary fact of contact, none of it means anything if there isn't something human at the center of it. I need to not lose that. I need to remember what I'm keeping this for. She brought that note to him. What does this mean? She asked. The last line, what are you keeping it for? He looked at the note for a moment. I wasn't sure until about 3 years ago, he said. Then I met a woman who told me that children understand that an afternoon can be infinite, that an hour can contain a whole world. She was quiet. I wanted to show her the valley, he said. I thought, if someone could stand in that valley and understand what it means, not the strategic value, not the geological significance, just what it means, then I'd know. Know what? That it was worth protecting, he said. The coalition meeting happened in June. Mara went with him. I picked her up from the airport on the way back. They'd flown into Portland, their first time in the city since she'd left, and I barely recognized her. Not because she looked different exactly, but because of the way she held herself. Something had settled in her, not the specific contentment of a person whose problems are solved, but the deeper, quieter kind that comes when you have walked through something hard and come out the other side of it more completely yourself. We sat in a coffee shop near my apartment, and she told me about the meeting. The Coalition Administrative Building. The representatives, 2 human, 3 Velthari, 1 Dvorak who had a translation unit because the Dvorak vocal range is mostly outside human hearing. The formal acknowledgement of the 3-generation Voss custodianship, the compensation agreement signing. How did it feel, I asked, sitting in that room? She thought about it. Like standing in the valley, she said. Like suddenly understanding the scale of something you've been living near for a long time without realizing it. And Eli. She looked at her coffee. He was, you know, that thing he does, where he's just steady. In that room with Velthari diplomatic representatives and coalition officials and all of it, he was exactly the same as he is in the kitchen making coffee. Exactly the same. She shook her head slightly. His grandfather would have been the same. I think they selected for that, actually, that particular steadiness. The Velthari selected the Voss family. They selected Aldous, she said, because of what he was. Eli inherited it, but yes, she paused. The Dvorak representative, his name translates to something like clear sight and depth, which sounds strange but I think is just a name. He said something to Eli before we left. Through the translation unit. He said something that translated roughly as, the line of custodians has honored the trust. The new partner of the line has the same quality. This was not expected but is valued. I stared at her. He was talking about you. I think so, she said. Eli thought so. He didn't seem surprised. She smiled slightly. He just said thank you. She told her mother in July. That conversation, by all accounts, went about as you'd expect. There was shock. There were tears, not sad tears, the complicated kind. There was a period where her mother sat very still in the kitchen on Talcott Street and looked at a point in the middle distance. Then her mother said, I thought he was poor. So did I, Mara said, for most of a year. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. He fixed my porch railing in September, she said. When you first moved up there, he came down and spent half a Saturday fixing my porch railing and wouldn't take anything for it. I know. He didn't have to do that. No. Her mother was quiet again. He's a good man, she said finally. Yes, Mara said, he's a very good man. Ending line. I went up to the mountain in September. Mara picked me up from town in the truck. She drove it now like she'd always driven it, confident, knowing exactly how much clearance the right side had on the narrow sections. And we went up through the Douglas firs and the first maples starting to go red and pulled up to the cabin. Eli met me at the door. He shook my hand, firm, brief, the handshake of a person who means it, and made coffee, and then found something to do outside so that Mara and I could have the kitchen to ourselves for an hour, the way he always seemed to understand when that was needed. After the coffee and the talking and the inevitable crying that happens when you see your oldest friend having a life that is genuinely hers, we went outside. She took me to the ridge. The east fence line path, same one they'd walked the first time. The October aspens were a week or two early that year. Climate patterns shifted even in Creston Valley, and they were already gold and trembling in the light. We came over the ridge and I stopped. Heron's Valley below us, the rust and amber grass, the cold creek catching the afternoon light, the silence. And under the silence, if you really listened, if you stood there long enough and stopped filling the quiet with your own noise, something else. A frequency, low, almost below hearing, like the world itself was resonating with something. Is that, I started. The valley, Mara said. We stood there for a while. Below us, in the valley that the Velthari had named the place of particular resonance, the light was doing something extraordinary, hitting the creek at an angle that turned it into a ribbon of gold, illuminating the grass in a way that made it look like it was lit from within, casting long shadows from the boulders on the east slope that stretched all the way to the tree line. I thought about Aldous Voss, 63 years old, standing on this ridge in 1987, watching a series of equipment malfunctions that he recognized, somehow, as something more. I thought about the patience of the Velthari. Their long survey passes over a blue planet they decided was worth approaching carefully. I thought about 3 generations of a family on a mountain, holding something vast and secret and extraordinary, keeping it the way you keep a fire, tending it, protecting it from wind, making sure it had what it needed to last. I thought about a woman who had come home to breathe and had found, in the last place she was looking, a life that contained more than she'd known to hope for. And Mara was standing next to me with mud on her boots and wind in her hair, and the same look on her face that I'd seen when she came down off this mountain the morning after the big conversation. That specific, settled, quietly radiant look of a person who has walked through something true. Eli's grandfather said something, she told me. She'd read it in his journals and memorized it. In 1994, after a particularly long communication exchange with the Velthari, he wrote it in the margin of his notes. What did he say? She looked out over the valley that hummed. He said, I have learned that the most important things do not announce themselves. They wait for you to become someone capable of receiving them. The aspens trembled in the ridge wind. Below us, the valley held its light. The corridor anchor point on Heron's Ridge became operational in November 2032. The Voss property is designated as a Coalition Heritage Site, the first human family residence to receive that designation. Heron's Valley remains protected, undeveloped, exactly as the Velthari requested. Mara started teaching again, remotely first and then in person, at the school in Creston Valley. She's been there 3 years now. She and Eli still walk the east fence line on October mornings when the aspens are going. They still share a thermos,